Police abuse remains one of the most serious and divisive human rights violations in the United States today. The horrific images of Rodney King being beat by the LAPD and the execution of Oscar Grant by the BART police are some of the most blatant reminders of police brutality against innocent victims. The excessive use of force by police officers, including unjustified shootings, severe beatings, and fatal chokings, persist because overwhelming barriers to accountability make it possible for officers who commit human rights violations to escape due punishment and often to repeat their offenses. Police and public officials greet each new report of brutality with denials or explain that the act was just an aberration, while the administrative and criminal systems that should deter these abuses by holding officers accountable instead virtually grant them impunity. This special insider exclusive investigation discovered that police brutality is persistent and rampant across America, and that systems to deal with abuse have failed, and that victims seeking redress face daunting obstacles at every point in the process, ranging from overt intimidation to the reluctance of local and federal prosecutors to take on brutality cases of officers who have committed these human rights violations. Despite claims to the contrary from city officials where abuses have become scandals in the media, efforts to make meaningful reforms have fallen short. The barriers to accountability are remarkably similar from city to city. Shortcomings in recruitment, training, and management are common to all. So is the fact that officers who repeatedly commit human rights violations tend to be a small minority who taint entire police departments but are protected routinely by the silence of their fellow officers and by flawed systems of reporting, oversight, and accountability. Today, the Justice in America TV series examines this epidemic in this new exclusive network TV special, Justice in America, Sahleem Tindle's story. Our news team sits down with well-known civil rights trial lawyers John Burris and Ben Nisenbaum, who represent Shaleem's family. On January 3rd, 2018, at approximately 4:20 p.m., BART officer Joseph Mateo shot and killed Sahleem Tindle, a 28-year-old African-American father of 2 children. The interaction was captured on the BART officer's body-worn camera.
Let me see your hands! 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 Let me see your hands now!
This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Oakland, California. It is my great pleasure to introduce John Burris and Ben Nisenbaum to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you, Steve.
John, you have expanded your practice here, haven't you?
Yes.
Tell our audience a little bit about the added partners and your law firm now.
Well, we've expanded to added 3 new partners and several different other associates. We've developed a Los Angeles office as well. And it really has given us an opportunity to be broader based and provide more services to the community at large. So we're real happy about it. It has taken place over the last couple of years, and the future is bright as it relates to what we have planned to do.
We are here today to talk about one of your recent cases, Sahleem Tindle. Ben, tell our audience a little bit about who Shaleem was.
Shaleem was a man with a young child who was killed by police in West Oakland when, after being involved in an altercation with another man. There was a gun involved in the altercation. There was a gunshot, and you can hear the officer responding to the sound of a gunshot and people pointing out where the 2 men were struggling, and the officer running really to that altercation.
And what happened?
So the officer's yelling, you know, show me your hands, show me your hands. The two men are struggling over the gun, and the officer doesn't know who fired the shot that was fired, but it apparently came from that gun. And the officer simply decided that Mr. Tindle was a threat as opposed to the other man, and shot Mr. Tindle in the back as Mr. Tindle was literally on his knees, lifting one hand, the only free hand he had, to surrender, a literal show of surrender with his left hand, while the other man while the gun was being struggled over in the right hand. The officer fired 3 shots into his back and killed him, and then he offered a false explanation. The officer claimed that Mr. Tindle was beginning to stand up and turn around, and he believed that Mr. Tindle was going to shoot him with the gun, and that clearly did not happen.
In these cases, John, you hear this all the time, don't you? The officer's going to give a reason why he's not at fault, right?
Absolutely.
Because if he doesn't, he might get sued, right? He may get fired. He's thinking of himself. In this particular case, though, the jury, and thank God there's juries, had to determine, was Tindle actually surrendering? Was he trying to surrender? What was most convincing to you?
I think that was most convincing. Number one, he had his hand up, his right hand up, like he was trying to surrender in response to the command. And secondly, that you could not see his other hand. We were able to convince the jury that even though you could not see the other hand, it was apparent that he was struggling with the other person who was also holding his arm in his hand. So the movement was that he had a hand up and his other hand was down below, and the other man who you could not see, they were struggling over the gun. So I think the jury was convinced that he was in fact trying to surrender, but he was prevented from surrendering because the other guy was holding his hand down and they were struggling.
Was that other guy ever called into court?
No, he was not called as a witness, and we was never to be...
By either side?
By either side, never to be seen from him again. He was a neighborhood guy, community guy, and the way this whole event started is apparently this person was trying to sell shoes on the street. Tindle was on his way with his family to the BART station, and he was being bothered or hassled. And as a consequence of that, they got into a bit of a verbal altercation, and then from there, the gun came out and shooting took place.
Now, the defense for the police, they used a defense of qualified immunity, right? And let's talk about that, because our audience doesn't understand that. And what is that kind of defense, Ben?
So qualified immunity is basically a Supreme Court decision that's become case law that says that if it is not well established that the officer's actions in this incident, whichever incident it is that's being litigated right now, if it's not well established that those actions would have violated the Constitution, then the officer is not going to be liable for those violations.
In other words, his reaction has to be a reasonable reaction. Is that right?
Well, that's part of it. So if it's unreasonable, it violates the Fourth Amendment.
Right.
But then he still has the qualified immunity defense if it's kind of murky as to whether or not his action would violate the Fourth Amendment.
This case was appealed on that basis, wasn't it?
It was. And I think the most important aspect of it, that, and even when you look at qualified immunity, the question, is there a material factual dispute in the case? The officer gives a position, and that position ostensibly is supposed to be reasonable. And then what happens is, if there's facts that are contrary to what that officer says, then you have a material dispute. That generally takes the matter outside of qualified immunity, assuming that it's well-established law. Well-established law is you can't shoot someone and kill them without just cause. Right. And if you don't have just cause, and in fact you do kill them, and there's a factual dispute as to circumstances how it happened, then generally qualified immunity does not apply. But it is a standard defense that is used about in every police case that we're involved in, particularly if there's a shooting case involved. And so it's very typical, and the matter did go before the Ninth Circuit, and we did prevail.
And there was a reason we prevailed, because the factual dispute here was whether or not Mr. Tindle was surrendering. And it is well established that you cannot shoot and kill a person who's surrendering.
And that's what the jury decided anyway, didn't
That's
it?
why that specific question was asked of the jury.
The jury is also, I think, impressed by the fact that their regulations required and state provisions that you're supposed to give a warning if reasonable. And there was ample opportunity to give a warning that if you don't stop what you're doing, we're going to shoot. Well, the officer did not do that, and he could have done it, given the examination we had, but he chose not to do it.
That gets back to, we've discussed this many, many times in all of your cases about police training, right? Do you think, I read recently that a lot of police forces are having trouble trying to hire new police officers because of cell phones, right? People are out there and they're documenting what's going on. Do you think, what kind of improved training do you think police officers should get so that when they're in these kinds of situations, they exercise better judgment?
Well, I think the question of assessment of fact pattern is important. Being able to assess and to reassess situations as facts change. I don't think cell phones in and of itself is the dangerous component of it all. I think that the truth of the matter is the officers are so used to having it their own way, it's been very difficult for them to then be held accountable and people looking over their shoulders and saying, you really could have done it a different way. One of the things we talked a lot about now, and that is for officers learning how to de-escalate a situation, to go from a threat assessment, but then look at the fact pattern to see if times and fact patterns have changed, and to de-escalate as those changes occur without using kind of the I'm in control, the force command. And we see this often in mentally impaired cases, and that's a huge issue when you have mentally impaired cases, is the failure to de-escalate. But I think that training is important, but officers are trained. They are trained. The question is following the training and then being held accountable. The question is, how do they handle the stress that they're under? Because when they're under the stress, sometimes they forget, they don't follow the training, they just react. And when they react without following their training, then they make bad decisions and people get killed, people get beat up. And when they could have, if they'd followed the training, de-escalated the situation and used, and lose less of a command structure and really put the situation in a less confrontational manner. That can be done. But unfortunately, all officers aren't willing to do that. Some are doing it better than others now, I think, But I don't think we should blame it on cell phones. Cell phones is an equalizer. One of the most important things that has taken place since the Rodney King case, which I did, many years ago. So there they had a camera, but since then the cell phones and body-worn cameras. Police officers have body-worn cameras now, and that's also important, and that also helped, I think, to improve the accountability for officers and also the community as well, because I think that body-worn cameras often support police officers in many more instances than not.
Right. Are the police required to release body camera footage as soon as possible? Because I don't think there's any kind of regulation.
No, there's a statute. There's clearly a statute that says you're supposed to do it within 45 days if it's reasonable and presentable to do so. You can delay it, but eventually you're going to have to release those body-worn cameras. And so that part has been important. That's a state statute. That has been passed several years ago. They're requiring that the body-worn cameras are released, and they should be released. There's always a question of not releasing because it matters on investigation, but that can't be indefinitely. That's really a question. At some point in time, they are going to get released either through the normal statutory period, through discovery, or through public records request. But they're not. You can't keep them forever, and that's clearly the case.
Right, and as we've seen in many cases with people with cell phones. Do you find that they come forward with these cell phone footage voluntarily?
Pretty much. Once people realize that something noteworthy has happened that they've captured on their cell phone, for the most part, we have seen people come forward.
Yeah, I remember in the Oscar Grant case, the cell phone footage was very valuable, wasn't it?
It was massive. I mean, that was a situation where we had what they call crushed cars. Everyone had cameras, and it was click, 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 click. And so it was invaluable. And even Bart had them as well. So cameras are just about everywhere, and I think that for our point of view, it has made our life a whole lot easier because it is contemporaneous eye on the situation, recording in real time. And, and maybe not, when officers are running toward a scene, you may not get it accurately because, as we found in this case here, that the camera is down below and the eye level is at a different level, so you can get a distorted view. But that's not always the case. In our situation here, we were able to get a close enough view where we could see the arm was in fact extended and that the officer was running up on the scene. And plus, he ultimately gave contradictory statements to what we could see on the camera.
There are some cities in the United States right now, and I'll name Chicago, for example, that have somewhere in the neighborhood of almost $500 million that they're paying out on various police cases. How do you see police organizations better training their officers? You say they're training them well, so that they don't have this huge debt that is really a taxpayer debt.
Look, it's an accountability question here. I mean, circumstances are going to arise. There's no question about that, where it's going to be a shoot, don't shoot situation. The question is, what is your training that allow you to assess properly whether or not a shooting should take place or not? We have situations where people are running away, and maybe they have committed some minor transgression, and you shoot them in the back.
Yeah.
Well, your training will say you shouldn't have done that, but your mental state and your emotions dictate and over-control it. The only way you can manage this is you have to hold officers accountable. That is proper discipline, ultimately even termination and/or prosecution. The biggest trouble that we have in all this is police unions, because police unions in and of themselves as a union are protective of officers themselves. And as a consequence, they're not prepared to hold officers accountable. And by not holding officers accountable, then the executives and the police command people have a difficult time trying to hold these officers accountable when the police unions themselves are seeking to justify the conduct that the officers are involved in. So it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. And Chicago pays out $500 million. Other places pay out a lot of money. We've done a lot less here in Oakland because of the reform issues that have taken place. It can be done. Yeah. But you have to be prepared to say an officer did wrong. And if you're not prepared to do that, then the officer will act as if that they have a license to continue that. Yeah. And when they have that license, they will continue to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to bring up an analogy. And in the issue of climate change, there are still people that are saying there's no climate change, but the insurance companies don't care whether you believe it or not. They're raising their rates, right? Which leads me to one other issue. And if you could answer this, Ben, self-insurance. How would that fly, and how would that maybe prevent a lot of these problems?
Well, I will tell you, we deal with some self-insured municipalities. So, for example, San Jose is self-insured, San Francisco is self-insured, and it tends to have the opposite effect, because the lawyers, so the training doesn't make the training better. It can make the litigation defense more aggressive. So we had a case in San Jose where a police officer shot a man in the back, a suicidal man in the back, and paralyzed him. And because there was nobody on the outside giving a different viewpoint into the echo chamber of the defense lawyers who worked for the city, they never evaluated the case correctly and never understood that it really was clear liability with massive damages. And this is a case we tried in 2015, John and I did, and we got an $11 million verdict in that case. And, at the end of the day, that was a case that could have settled for less than that, and probably, if there were a reasonable calculation on the other side, would have. So self-insurance can have the opposite effect.
There are two things that are taking place now, futuristically, and that is insurance companies are saying to cities, we're not going to keep insuring you if you do not get a control over your police officers. Right. And that has taken place in a number of cities, and that has been very significant. The other issue of the officers themselves having self-insurance, that the officers themselves have their own insurance.
Do they?
They have. That's another issue that's developing, and whether officers themselves should have insurance as opposed to just the city. As long as the officers themselves are not held financially accountable, then you're not going to have complete control over them, because as long as the city is obligated to pay and the officers themselves are not obligated to pay, well, there's no incentive for them to control their behavior beyond what they would normally do.
Right. How can they afford that kind of insurance? They're in a dangerous job.
The officers are paid well. And these are not officers. These are not school moms. These are people who are making $150,000, $200,000. Some of the highest paid people in the city of Oakland are police officers because of the overtime that they get. That's not to say that it has to occur. I'm just saying that's one of the new thinkings that's taking place. Maybe we can control the officers better if they had to get their own personal insurance, and therefore they had to pay out of their pocket for that insurance. That might control their behavior. Right now, they have to pay no money. Even when we got cases where punitive damages occur, where cities are not obligated to pay, cities pay it anyway. So, and to some extent, there's no sweat off the back, no money off the back of police officers.
Well, great job. I want to thank you for being on the show, and keep at it.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.